Good morning. Good to see you all this morning, and good to be starting off a new sermon series entitled Living. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes in my life I wish there was an instruction manual for living. You know what I'm saying? Like kind of an IKEA style instruction manual. It's got, instead of words, because they ship all over the world, it's got little pictures, right? Little stick figures and the right tools and the right size pieces that fit everything that's going to happen. So you just open up the instruction manual, okay, page 16, and then you're good to go, right? I mean, wouldn't that just be delightful to have some sort of manual to just show us how to live? Or said another way, wouldn't it be great to have instructions for living a life? Now, some people would say, and maybe you expect for me to say, that the Bible is an instruction book for living a life. And the Bible absolutely gives us all sorts of lessons to live by, stories that help us, give us purpose and meaning. But if you've tried to open up your Bible and put your finger in one spot and say, it's going to tell me what I need to know, it might cause you some consternation, right? The stories are strange. It's sometimes hard to get an entry point into it. It isn't as clear as an IKEA instruction book, for sure. Well, last week, Pastor Lilliard was bold enough to say, I'm going to use a poem in his sermon last week. If you miss it, fabulous sermon, go back and take a look. But upon his invitation, I thought this week I would also include a poem, a very short little piece by one of the great poets of the United States, Mary Oliver. Instructions for living a life. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. Now, I think that the disciples would have wanted some sort of instruction book or instruction manual in this moment in the biblical story. All right, Pastor Sarah read a reading from the book of Acts, which actually is like part 2 of one of the Gospels. Now, the Gospels all tell the story about Jesus' life, his miracles. They follow him around the world, and they show him teaching to crowds and performing miracles and doing all sorts of things. Each of the Gospels tell the story of Jesus as he walked toward his death in Jerusalem, and they all tell the story of his resurrection. But only one of the Gospels has a part 2, and that's the Gospel of Luke. And the part 2 to the Gospel of Luke is the book of Acts. And so Pastor Sarah read from the very first verses of this book of Acts. And you see the disciples who have gathered around. And this book of Acts says that Jesus appeared to them for 40 days after he was risen. That Jesus was hanging out in Jerusalem, showing up to the disciples, helping teach them and show them what they needed to know. And I can only imagine if you're a disciple and you just saw Jesus die, and then you heard that he had risen from the dead, and all of a sudden you start to see him appear. I would want to capture every single thing that he said in those 40 days, wouldn't you? I'd be taking feverish notes. What do you have? What's the last thing you're going to give us, Jesus? I imagine that they would stay up late into the evening, and I don't know, maybe Jesus didn't get tired. Were these 24 hours where Jesus was just teaching and teaching and teaching and teaching? Or maybe it was late into the night and they all got tired and fell asleep, comparing notes the next morning. Did you catch what he said about this? Or did you hear what he said yesterday morning? This is what I wrote down. I'm sure that they wanted to just capture everything so that they would know what came next. Because they, if we were asking the question of them, what does it mean to be living with Jesus, would have a very clear explanation, right? Well, we followed him. He was here, I could talk with him, and we shared meals together. We saw him do some amazing things, and the stories that he told, you can only imagine the stories that he told. But now, in this story, Jesus is no longer someone that you're walking step by step with. Jesus is no longer somebody that you can just ask a question of. Hey, what was up with that miracle? Hey, what did you mean by that parable? Jesus, as it shows in the story, rises into heaven. And the church has called this the ascension story, which ascension, of course, is a fancy word to mean rising into heaven. And we see this very strange image of the disciples all gathered around. And they've been trying to capture every last word of Jesus. And all of a sudden, he starts rising into the heavens. And I can only imagine that the disciples are watching as he just goes higher and higher and higher, and maybe eventually through the cloud cover, and they're just stuck there, their jaws on the floor, wondering what happens next. I can't ask Jesus that question I always wanted to ask him. I can't follow him to the next town and let him take the lead. The disciples, if we were asking them, I'm sure that they would have wished for an instruction manual. But instead, the disciples are just looking up at the heavens. It's like when you've been in a scene, right? Like maybe you've gone on a hike somewhere and you take that really big breath at the end of the hike and look over the view in front of you, trying to just capture it. You see it stretch out as far as you can imagine. Scenes that you couldn't capture in a word or a poem or a phrase or a story, or even in that machine in the back of our pockets. We can't quite ever capture the beauty in front of us. So as the disciples looked up at the heavens, looked up at the sky, they were unable to even describe what they were seeing. And I think probably those disciples, I'm sure that they were looking for instructions for living a life. I am certain that those disciples, if Jesus would have opened a wonderful IKEA manual, that they would have snatched it up and followed it. But they, like us, had to figure it out as we go along. They had to hunt and peck and ponder and question. They had to take step after step and wonder, is this where Jesus is leading me? So I wonder if, of anything, maybe we start with these short instructions from Mary Oliver, and alas, 3 points from Mary Oliver. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. So number 1, pay attention. Now this is a harder task than I think we like to admit. Anybody hear these 2 words and immediately get transported back to like 2nd grade? Yeah? And maybe a little, pay attention. Or maybe in the middle of a extensive algebra lesson in 9th grade, and you're just caught daydreaming, and all of a sudden the leader says, hey you, pay attention, right? A true confession. I remember just the other day that I have actually been copying down the words that I've written down the most are probably not the most helpful. When I was in the 3rd grade, if I forgot to write my name in the top right-hand corner of the paper, the consequence was that I turned in a paper full of my name, right? Anybody ever have to do that? Both sides. I can write my name really well now. Good success in 3rd grade. In 7th grade, it was a whole blackboard, right? You remember these big blackboards and the chalk, and the sentence, which surprises no one, particularly my spouse and my children. The sentence that I can still recall to this day was, "I will not converse unnecessarily during class." It's amazing I ended up doing what I'm doing, huh? Perhaps there's gifts even in those spaces where we think we're messing things up. But paying attention is a really hard thing to do. It isn't just something about sitting in a classroom and turning on our brains and getting those last bits of information. It's not like the disciples could pay attention to everything that Jesus said and really just gather it. There's so many moments in our lives where we just can't pay attention to it all. We live with computers in our pockets that at any given moment, I have one in my back pocket right now, it could buzz or beep or chirp or sing and all of a sudden tell me about news halfway around the world, or that I forgot to go to my doctor's appointment on Tuesday, or that I purchased something on the internet yesterday, or that the weather will be the same today as it was yesterday, or any number of things. We're constantly bombarded with information that we have no ability to grab or capture or contain or even attempt to understand. Constantly barraged by stuff, beeps, whistles, honks, all of the things, right? So paying attention is sometimes a challenge. Have you ever gone out to dinner with somebody and looked around? Next time you're out, count how many people are this. Or you're at a movie or a gathering and how many people are not listening to each other, not paying attention, right? It's not often about the things that we say, but even the way that we show that we're present for one another. And I think pay attention, number one, is directly connected to the second, which is be astonished. Pay attention, be astonished. The other day, a few weeks ago, I was in my office, which is just right around the corner here. And our senior director of church operations, Maggie Wagner, if you haven't gotten to know her yet, she's delightful, has a fantastic sense of humor. You will like her a lot. And for someone who crunches numbers, who has a fantastic sense of humor, that is a win for me. I love it. No, we have a lot of fun. And Maggie and I were talking about a budget, and we had a lot of questions, and we were focused on some really kind of small details back and forth, having a meeting. And all of a sudden, I see out the window something just flash by, and immediately I was no longer paying attention. Someone should have rapped on my skull and said, "Matthew, pay attention," right back in third grade once again. But what I saw out the window was a whir. And I just paused and I said, "Hold on." And it came out again. And I said, "Maggie, you got to look at this." And so we let our business just wait for a minute. And we both looked out the window and we saw a fawn, tiny little fawn, about this big. And it was sprinting across the lawn. There's this little strip of lawn right out here. And it sprinted from one end to the other and then just hid away in the tall grass once more. And as we waited just another 2 seconds, we saw it again, sprint all the way to the other side of the lawn and tuck away in the grass. And it came out a third time, sprint all the way to the other side. And Maggie and I are just silent, right? Just watching this. And then we see Mama just peek her head out of the grass, around the tree cover, and take 2 slow, deliberate steps onto the lawn, making sure that kiddo is doing fine. And sure enough, sprint. And it's almost if the fawn is like, "Hey, Mom, come on, let's go." You know, right? Let's run, let's sprint. And Mom, frankly, looked annoyed, right? She's standing there like, "Okay, come on, kid. We've been chasing you around Eden Prairie for hours." And Maggie and I stood there. And Maggie said, "Grab your camera." And of course, as soon as I reached to grab my phone, which whenever you need it, you can't find it. At least that's the way my life seems to work. As soon as I find it, they're gone. Back in the wild, back in the bushes, and the moment is away. And so then we took just a moment to appreciate this life right in front of us, this sprinting new fawn right around the corner. We together were astonished. We were brought into something else. Beyond the details of the budget and the narrative and all of the things that we were discussing, we saw that we're a part of something much bigger, much grander than the little thing that we had to get done. Of course, we made our way back. We got our business done. But let ourselves be astonished, even in the most humdrum, mundane moments of our existence. We have opportunity to be surprised. We do. Even, if I can offer one more example, in the story that you've heard 3,000 times, you know this story, right? It might be a story that Uncle Tom always tells, right? At the family gathering. Or it might be a story that your mother or your father tells, and they say it again and again and again, and you can always remember the way that it turns this time. Or maybe it's somebody at work, right? That right before lunch, that story, again, I've heard that one before. But even in a story like that, could you be astonished? What if you asked a question that you'd never asked before? How did you feel when that happened? Where were you when that happened? What was the day like? What if you get curious? You see, in order to actually pay attention and be astonished, we have to start to get curious about the things that are all around us. We have to start to wonder about what is right in front of us that otherwise we would have missed. Which leads us, of course, to number 3, to tell about it. The disciples had a choice in this story. They could have stayed there, looking up at heaven. They could have taken in all of the wonder, all of the awe, all of the beauty. They could have taken their notes that they had written down feverishly in those 40 days, tucked them under their pillows, savored every last morsel of them, and enjoyed the rest of their lives. But they were asked to be witnesses. They were asked to point toward something. They were asked to point toward this living Christ that was and taught and healed and transformed and challenged and told these amazing stories and is and forever will be. They were asked to be witnesses to the way that Jesus worked in their own lives and the way that they believe that Jesus works still in the world. They were asked to imagine, to dream, to trust that God is still working in their day-to-day existence. And the disciples' lives were anything but boring. Read the rest of the book of Acts and you will find out how wild their lives were. But they had to bear witness to the way that Jesus was working in their lives. So perhaps we have instructions for living a life. They might not be as tidy as an IKEA manual, but they might be even more wondrous than anything that can fit in a perfectly square cardboard box. So my question, and each week of this sermon series, we are going to be sending you out into the world to be on the lookout for these moments. And my question for you is, where will you expect to see Jesus this week? I actually want you to make a date with Jesus. It's not about, that's a good thought and a question, and I'm sure I can bump into Jesus here and there. No. Tell me where, like the spot, right? Give a geolocation. It's this place on my deck where I sit every morning. It's this corner where I walk on my route with my kids every afternoon. It's this chair that I always want to sit at the community pool, even if it's full. It's that spot in my office where I know there's somebody that I need to talk with. Where will you meet Jesus this week? And I think the question that haunted the disciples, where will we see this living Jesus, still is with us today. And so my offer for you today is, where will we meet Jesus? Where will we experience the living Christ? Well, maybe we can look up, just like the disciples did. All the way up, as a friend of mine says. Go ahead. It's not going to hurt. Look up. Here. Here's where we meet Jesus. But not just in these four walls. Everywhere. So this week, let us know about that date. Let us know who shows up, what words they whisper, and how you might pay attention, be astonished, and tell us about it. Amen.